Hello folks, this is David Hurley of EasyChessTips.com, and today I want to show you a game of chess that I played with my regular chess partner here in Hiroshima, Dr. Mogami. We played a game on the 28th of February 2018 in which I was white and he was black. I've logged into my account on GameNock.com, which is my go-to site when I'm playing chess on the internet. I've logged into here so that I can bring up the practice chessboard and go through the moves that we made in this game. So when I'm white, generally speaking, I will follow the advice of John Watson in his excellent book, A Strategic Chess Opening Repertoire for White, and open with d5. He recommends that we put together an opening repertoire, d5, c5, knight to c3. No, that should be d4, c4, knight to c3, which is quite a standard and solid opening for white, playing the queen's pawn openings. So whenever possible, that's what I do. So I open with d4. Dr. Mogami responded with d5. I put in the c4 move, offering this pawn as a gambit pawn, which can be taken with no immediate response. If this option is taken by black, we are in the queen's gambit accepted. However, in our game on Wednesday, d4, d5, c4, the gambit pawn is offered, but it is not taken. So we move into the queen's gambit declined. And the queen's gambit declined, the second move for black is usually e6, but it doesn't have to be. And in fact, Dr. Mogami moved the knight to f6. I continued with my standard third move, following John Watson's advice, knight to c3, and now e6 came in here, and we are in fact in the same position as we would have been. It's just a transposition, and this is a classic setup for the queen's gambit declined. Here I take the pawn, so c takes d5, and black has a choice here. If black is actually going to take the pawn, there's the crazy choice, of course, of queen takes pawn, immediately losing to knight takes queen. So that aside, these two pieces here, the pawn or the knight, could take this pawn. Quite often we see this move here, the knight takes the pawn, perhaps expecting the knight to take the knight, and then either the pawn can take that knight or the queen can take that knight. But that is not the recommended move by John Watson, and for very good reason. e4 would be recommended here, at which point the knight could retreat, but very often will take the knight down here, and the b pawn takes back. Now what this does is gives white a very strong central majority of pawns early in the game. So if you're faced with the knight taking your pawn, that's e4. Knight will very often take the knight, and then you can get that central majority. We have played that pattern before, and white has done very well. So Dr. Mogami did not do that on this occasion, but took with the pawn, at which point bishop to g5. Bishop to g5 pins the knight to the queen. If the knight were to move, the queen would fall. So after bishop to g5, bishop to e7 is a good, solid, standard response. Unpinning the knight is now free to move, free to protect that pawn from this marauding knight if necessary. e3, good solid move is e3, makes that pawn chain. c6, black also sets up a pawn chain on this side, and bishop to d3. Now in the next move, Dr. Mogami came over here. Knight B to D7. Now, knight B to D7, I responded with queen to C2. But in his book, John Watson suggests that when faced with knight B to D7, it's better to keep up the development, the pace of development, by moving straight away with knight to F3. Scenario number 1, knight B to D7, queen to C2. And so I have prepared the board to have a look at what happens when black moves the B knight to D7 and white responds with queen to C2. So black moves knight to F8, knight to F3, knight comes now to E6, attacking here the white bishop. So the white bishop could either take the knight or move back. Here in this scenario, it will move back. The pawn to G6, castle, knight now bangs into that G7 square, aiming to come here to attack this bishop, but not immediately. B4 is played. We won't get into this now. This is quite a tricky move. It looks like a pawn is being offered to the bishop, but in the only game on GameNot that I can find with this, where the bishop takes that pawn, black lost, and that was a 21,000 rated player losing to a 22,000 rated player. So that's at a far higher level of chess play than we are indulging in or engaging in our friendly games. That aside, let's move on. So now here is the aim of the original setup, of moving knight B to D7 and then over here, and into here, with the aim of coming to the square that the bishop is currently occupying. The bishop is free now to come to F5 and attack the queen bishop pair down here. And that happens. Let's see what happens if the bishop takes. The bishop takes, the knight takes the bishop and is now attacking the bishop over here. So with that in mind, there's nowhere, well, the bishop could come over here, I suppose, but I think in most cases the bishop will take the knight. The bishop replies here. Let's have a look at what John Watson says about this. Well, let me just point out that John Watson says that when the black puts in that bishop to F5 move, he thinks that white has good ideas against it, but probably the easiest thing to do is sidestep, i.e. save a tempo by foregoing that queen to C2 move and by moving knight to F3 on the 8th move. That's knight to F3 instead of queen to C2. And now let's look at what happens when we follow his advice and do that. Scenario number 2, knight B to D7, knight to F3. Ta-tan! Okay, so here we are with the board set up in the position that we had after bishop to D3, knight moves to D7, knight B moves to D7, and this time, instead of moving the queen to C2, we will follow John Watson's advice and move the knight to F3. And here's what happens. The knight moves into F8. Now white is free to castle, and the knight comes out attacking the bishop as in the previous scenario, and the bishop moves back to H4, g6 comes in, and interestingly we have the b4 shocker of a move with an exclamation mark and question mark to suggest that it's an interesting move. But black is not going to fall for that old trick and will castle, at which point the rook comes into b1, and the comment is, after 11 b4, ta-tan, the shocker of a move, black castles, and then what happens next? Number 12, move number 12, rook to b1, and the comment is rook to b1 puts white well along in his queenside strategy of playing b4 to b5. And we now return to the game. In fact, Dr. Mogami had no intention of putting his knight down there. The next move was, I think, the first mistake of black's game. It was bishop to b5. Now, I think it's a mistake because it repins this knight back to the queen. Once again, the knight cannot move because the bishop is eyeing the queen. So that knight is repinned. Now, the bishop has pinned white's knight to the king for sure, but it's taken 2 moves to get there. We had over here bishop to e7, unpinning the knight, and then we have these moves here. Now suddenly a black player has really changed his mind and decided, oh, I want to do that after all. So there is, I think, a loss of tempo for black here. I believe it helps to give white more of an edge. So that was bishop to b5. I attacked here, and I checked the stats on GameNot, and on GameNot, relatively few players immediately attack here. A more common move is to bring the knight here, adding extra protection to the knight and opening the way for the king to castle. But anyway, that's what I did. a3, the bishop moves back to here. Now, I expected that move, and I think, bearing in mind, I think that this is a mistake anyway. I attacked the bishop expecting that move, and it knocks the bishop off this diagonal here. And I then continue the attack on the bishop. Now, also, another thing to bear in mind, I'm moving these pawns forward. My goal in this setup is to castle on the king's side and to develop my, move my pawns up here, to develop an attack on the queen's side. So, to my mind, black is actually helping me to achieve my aims. The bishop moved down here to c7, so getting onto this diagonal. And now I develop that knight, the f3 knight, or the knight to f3. And now we have a counterattack on this bishop to attempt to unpin the bishop. No, it's not unpinning the bishop, it's unpinning the knight. I would expect in this setup for black to castle on the king's side. And here we see a loosening of the king's side pawn. So again, I'm quite happy to indulge black in this by moving my bishop back, maintaining the pin here. Bishop to h4, g5. So now black's pawns are loosened from in front of the king's side. Bishop comes down to g3. And the next move is an interesting move. Black continues the pawn advance, attacking the knight. Now, this is not a good move to make now, but it does open up the possibility at some stage of repinning that knight to the queen. But not now, because the knight is under attack. Now, sometimes in these situations, when one piece is under attack, you can throw the opposition off balance by taking another piece and counter-attacking while still leaving this attack here unresolved. But I didn't do that. Where are we? I moved the knight forward. Knight to e5. I was wondering if black wouldn't take with the knight, but I think this is again slowing down the pace of black's development. Black moved the queen to e7, which means that this bishop is now unprotected by anything. So I took with the knight. Knight takes d7, and now, because this bishop is unprotected and under attack from this bishop, I mean, black, following that theme before of attacking with different pieces, black could, of course, simply take the bishop down here. But there is this rather worrying knight down here. Now, there are three pieces that could take the knight. There's the bishop, there are four pieces that could take it. There's the knight, there's the queen, and there's the king. But you have to go careful which piece you take the knight with because of this unprotected bishop. If you take with this bishop, then that bishop falls to this move. The queen is no longer protecting the bishop, blocked by the bishop on d7. So you have to go careful in these situations which piece you take back with. So Dr. Mogami sensibly took back with the queen here. Queen takes d7. Bishop to e5. Now this bishop comes in, protected by this pawn, pinning the knight this time to the rook, at which stage the bishop takes the bishop, and the d pawn moves up one and attacks the knight. The pawn chain now is somewhat diminished, but attacking the knight, it was well, we're going to take back the bishop. We're not going to sit there and just look at the bishop. The only piece that can take it on the board is the d4 pawn. That now opens up the possibility for a counter-attack down here, but this doesn't worry me that that my knight is also under attack, because the exchange will lead white to gain material. White will go one pawn up in the exchange, and that's in fact what happens. White takes black's knight on f6, black takes white's knight on c3, the queen takes the pawn. We're one up now in material, and the queen is protecting the advanced pawn here. So there's a pawn deep in black's territory, and we're a pawn up. Queen to d5. The queen comes down here, queen to d5. Looking, by the way, at this unprotected pawn here. However, e4 moves up a pawn, attacks the queen, and protects this pawn from the queen's gaze. The queen moved to g5, comes across here on this diagonal. At which point, well, let's keep attacking the queen. The queen is starting to dance. So h4. This gives black the option of taking en passant here. An immediate response is the en passant take. But that didn't happen. The queen moved across to f4. No, that doesn't make sense, does it? The queen moved across to f4, not f5, the crazy suicide move. The queen moved to f4. Attack the queen again, g3. The queen then moves back to this square here, c7. So the queen has moved 1, 2, 3, 4 times in a row, dancing around. We've been able to move our pawns up. Our kings, both of our kings, are still in the center. So I feel with this setup here that white has an advantage. 1 pawn up, 1 pawn deep in enemy territory, and a possibility of supporting that pawn with some more material, as you'll see in a moment. So queen to c, queen to c7, e5, supporting that pawn, bringing another pawn closer to the 8th row.